The meeting room was cold, and not only because of the air. Ambassador Marcus Webb sat alone at a long silver table. Across from him sat 3 officers of the Korath Dominion. Their skin was gray and rough, like old stone, and their eyes were small and black. Their leader sat in the middle. His name was Grand Admiral Threk, and he was the largest of the 3, with wide shoulders and a voice that sounded like rocks grinding together. Behind Threk, a large screen showed hundreds of warships floating in the dark of space. This was the Korath Third Fleet, one of many fleets that had helped the Korath Dominion conquer 17 other star systems over the last 200 years. Every species the Dominion had met, it had beaten. Every species had bent the knee, sooner or later. Ambassador Webb, Threk said, "We have read your species' answer. You wish to stay independent. You wish to keep your small colonies and your little ships." He paused. 2 officers behind him made a strange clicking sound. It took Webb a moment to understand that they were laughing. Webb kept his face calm. "Humanity is not asking for your permission, Admiral. We are telling you that we will not join the Dominion. We do not want a war, but we will defend what belongs to us." Threk leaned forward. "Do you know how many fleets larger than this one we have sent against enemies stronger than you? The Dren Alliance had 10,000 ships. They are gone now. The Yultok had weapons that could crack a moon in half. Now they mine rock for us in the dark." He waved a thick gray hand at the screen behind him. "And you, humanity, you have been in space for what, 300 years? Your biggest ship could fit inside one hangar bay of my flagship. Size is not everything," Webb said quietly. The clicking laughter came again, louder this time. One young officer said something in his own language, and Threk answered him with a short word. The room went quiet, but the young officer kept smiling, his flat teeth showing. "You are a brave man, Ambassador," Threk said. "Or a foolish one, perhaps both. I will give your species one chance. 10 days. In 10 days, my fleet will arrive at the colony world you call Meridian. If your people are wise, they will already be packing their things to serve the Dominion. If they are not wise," he let the sentence hang in the air, and smiled with too many teeth. "We have burned planets before. It saves us the trouble of moving furniture." The other 2 officers made the clicking sound again. Webb stood up slowly. He did not shout, and he did not argue. He simply looked at Threk, and for one small moment, something in his quiet stare made the Grand Admiral's smile falter. "You will remember this day, Admiral," Webb said. "Not because you won something, but because you laughed at the wrong people." He allowed himself the faintest, thin smile, then turned and walked out, his footsteps the only sound as the doors closed behind him. Far away on the Korath flagship, a smaller officer named Dorn watched a recording of the meeting on his private screen. Dorn was the fleet's science officer, and he had served in 3 campaigns before this one. In each of those campaigns, the enemy had always done one of 2 things. They had begged for mercy, or they had fought bravely and died anyway. He had never seen an enemy stay so calm while being told his whole world would burn. Dorn closed the recording and said nothing. It was not his place to question the Grand Admiral, but he made a small note in his private files, the kind of note a careful officer keeps just in case. The human ambassador did not seem afraid. He wrote, "We should ask ourselves why." 200 light-years away, on Meridian Colony, Governor Anya Kessler was drinking her morning coffee when the message arrived. Meridian was not a large colony, not compared to the great cities of Earth. It had been settled 40 years earlier by families who wanted open land and a fresh start, and it had grown slowly into a place of small farms, quiet towns, and one modest starport that saw maybe 3 ships a week. A little over 2 million people called it home. Most of them had never seen a Korath ship or any alien ship at all, except in news reports about wars on worlds far away. Kessler read the message twice before setting her coffee down. 10 days, 300 warships. Surrender or die. She called her defense council within the hour. General Okafor, who commanded Meridian's small planetary fleet, arrived looking like he had not slept. 40 ships, he said, before she could even ask. That's what we have. 40 ships, most built for patrol work, not war, against 300 Korath warships built for conquest. Can Earth send reinforcements in time? Kessler asked. Even at best speed, no full fleet can reach us in 10 days. Earth Command knows this. I already sent the request. Kessler looked out the window of her office at the town below, where children were walking to school and farmers were driving trucks full of grain to market. None of them yet knew that a fleet built to conquer worlds was on its way to visit them. "Then what do we do?" she asked quietly. Okafor did not have a good answer. "We prepare what defenses we can. We move as many people as possible into the shelters, and we hope Earth Command has something we don't know about yet." He was right to hope. At that very moment, in a quiet room at Earth Fleet Command, a very different kind of meeting was taking place. Around a long table sat 6 senior officers of the United Terran Fleet, along with Admiral Ruiz, who had traveled all the way from a hidden base near Jupiter just for this meeting. Fleet Admiral Whitfield, the highest-ranking officer in the room, tapped a finger against the table as she listened to the reports. 40 ships at Meridian, she said, against 300. Even scraping together every ship we can spare from nearby systems, we cannot get more than 60 additional ships there in time. That is not enough to win. It may not even be enough to survive. There is another option, Ruiz said. Several officers exchanged glances. One of them, an older admiral named Chen, frowned deeply. "You mean the ghost ship program?" "I mean the Nightshade," Ruiz said. "She's ready. Her crew is ready. She may be the only asset we have that could change the outcome at Meridian without losing thousands of lives in a fight we cannot win in the open. That program has never been tested against a real enemy fleet," Admiral Chen said. "You are asking us to bet a colony of 2 million people on one experimental ship and 12 crew members. I am asking you to consider that 60 extraordinary ships will slow the Korath fleet down by perhaps an hour," Ruiz said. "The Nightshade, if she performs the way she was designed to, could take that fleet apart before it ever reaches orbit." Fleet Admiral Whitfield was quiet for a long moment, and the whole room waited on her answer. "Send the ordinary reinforcements as planned," she said finally. "Every ship we can spare, and Ruiz," she turned to him, "send the Nightshade as well, quietly. If she fails, the Korath will never even know she existed, and if she succeeds—" She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. 3 hours later, Admiral Ruiz stood on an observation deck above a hangar carved into solid rock, looking down at a ship that most of the fleet still did not officially believe was real. The base was called Ashfall Station, though nobody quite remembered why. It floated quietly in the asteroid belt beyond Jupiter, far from any normal shipping lane, known to fewer than 200 people across the whole of Earth's territory. Inside its hangar sat a single warship with no lights, no markings, and no flag. Its hull was a flat, dull black that seemed to swallow light instead of reflecting it. It was smaller than most Dominion ships would even consider worth a second look, but it was, in fact, the single most expensive and most secret project the United Terran Fleet had ever built. Its name was the Nightshade. Captain Elena Cross stood beside Ruiz on the observation deck, watching her ship. She was in her early 40s, with short dark hair and a thin scar along her left eyebrow from an old accident she rarely spoke about. She had commanded the Nightshade program for 4 years, ever since it had been nothing more than blueprints and a wild idea that most of the fleet had dismissed as fantasy. "You've seen the report from the meeting with the Korath?" Ruiz asked. "I have," Cross said, without turning around. 10 days, Ruiz said. Then a fleet of at least 300 Korath warships arrives at Meridian Colony. Their defense fleet has 40 ships, most of them old. If the Korath attack with full force, Meridian falls in hours. "I know the numbers, sir." "Then you know what I'm about to ask you." Cross finally turned to face him. "You're going to ask if the Nightshade is ready." "Is she?" Cross was quiet for a moment. The Nightshade's cloaking system, which the engineers simply called the Shadow Field, was the most advanced piece of technology humanity had ever built. Unlike older stealth systems that only hid a ship from radar, the Shadow Field bent light itself around the hull, making the ship invisible not just to sensors but to the human eye. A person could stand 10 steps from the Nightshade while it ran the Shadow Field and see nothing but empty space. But the system was new. It had only been tested under small, careful conditions. It had never faced a real battle against a real fleet of hundreds of ships. "She's ready enough," Cross said at last. "She has to be. There's no time left to wait for a better answer. 20 minutes later, in a cramped briefing room just off the main hangar, Cross stood before all 12 members of her crew for the last time before launch. She kept the briefing short. Everyone in the room had trained for this moment for years, and there was little left to say that they did not already know. "You've all seen the numbers," Cross said. 300 Korath warships, 10 days out from Meridian, 40 local defense ships, plus whatever reinforcements Earth can scrape together in time, which won't be enough. We are the only piece on the board that Fleet doesn't know exists. That means we choose when and how we fight, not them. "What's the mission exactly?" asked one of the younger crew members, a sensor technician named Diaz who had never flown a real combat mission before. "Shadow the fleet the whole way in," Cross said. "Learn everything we can about how they move and how they fight. Then, when the moment is right, we make sure that fleet arrives at Meridian a lot weaker than it left home. We are not here to win a fair fight. We are here to make sure there isn't one." "And if we're seen?" Park asked, though everyone already knew the answer. "Then 12 of us are facing 300 of them, alone, with no one coming to help," Cross said plainly. She did not soften it, because there was no way to soften it that would still be honest. "So we don't get seen. Every decision we make from the moment we leave this hangar is built around that one rule. Nair keeps the field stable. Torres flies us like we're made of glass. Park only fires when a clean shot is worth the risk. And I make the call on when that risk is worth taking." She looked around the small room at the faces of the people who had spent years training for a mission most of the fleet still refused to believe was possible. 2 million people are asleep on a colony world right now, who have no idea their lives depend on whether 12 strangers can stay hidden in the dark for the next 10 days, Cross said. "Let's not let them down." No one answered. No one needed to. The crew filed out toward their stations, and down in the hangar, they began their final checks. There were only 12 of them, a tiny number for a warship, but the Nightshade was not built to fight like a normal warship. She was not built to stand toe-to-toe with an enemy fleet. She was built to hide, to watch, and to strike only when it truly mattered. Commander Sam Park, the ship's weapons officer, ran his hand along a missile rack, checking the seals for what felt like the 100th time. Park had transferred from a destroyer 3 years earlier, when a recruiter had approached him with a strange offer. "We're building something new, something that might end wars before they really start. Are you interested?" He had not fully believed the pitch until the day he watched the Nightshade vanish in front of his own eyes during a test flight. "You're going to wear a hole in that rack," said a voice behind him. It was Dr. Priya Nair, the ship's chief engineer, and the person who understood the shadow field better than anyone alive, since she had helped design it herself. "Just making sure it's ready," Park said. "It's ready," Nair said. "The real question is whether we are." She looked tired. She had been awake for almost 2 days straight, running final tests on the cloak's power system. The shadow field used more energy than the ship's weapons and engines combined. If the crew fired a weapon while cloaked, the field would weaken for a few seconds while power redirected to the guns. It was the one flaw Nair had never fully solved. Fire a weapon, and for a short window, the ship became just slightly easier to find. Not fully visible, but not perfectly hidden either. At the front of the ship, in the cramped cockpit, Lieutenant Jake Torres ran the last checks on the engines. Torres was the youngest member of the crew, only 26, but he had the steadiest hands anyone at the Fleet Academy had ever tested. He would need them. Flying a cloaked ship meant flying mostly blind, trusting instruments over eyes, moving slowly and carefully through space, where one wrong turn could send them drifting straight into an enemy hull. 2 minutes to the captain's arrival, a voice said over the comm. Torres took a slow breath and looked out the front window at the rock walls of the hangar. Somewhere out there, past the asteroid belt, past the edge of human space, a fleet of 300 alien warships was getting ready to fly toward Meridian Colony, carrying enough weapons to burn every city on the planet to ash. And it would be Torres, Park, Nair, and 9 other crew members, hidden inside a ship the Korath did not even know existed, who would try to stop them. Captain Cross arrived on the hangar floor 20 minutes later, already dressed in her flight uniform. She stopped at the base of the boarding ramp and looked back at Admiral Ruiz, who had followed her down. If this works, Ruiz said, you will have saved a colony of 2 million people and maybe stopped a war before it truly starts. And if it doesn't work? Ruiz did not answer right away. Then at least the Korath will learn that we don't go down without trying something clever. Cross allowed herself a small, thin smile. I'll take that as a vote of confidence, sir. She climbed the ramp into the nightshade. Behind her, the hangar doors began their slow, silent opening, letting in the black of space and the far light of the sun. The crew took their stations. Torres brought the engines up to a soft hum. Park ran one last check of the weapons. Nair watched the power readings on the shadow field with the focus of someone watching a heart monitor. All stations ready, Captain, Park said. Cross settled into the command chair. On the main screen in front of her, a star map showed the long, empty path between Ashfall Station and the edge of Korath space, where the Third Fleet was gathering before its advance on Meridian. Engage the shadow field, she said. Nair's hands moved across her console. There was a soft hum, and the lights inside the ship dimmed slightly as power redirected. Outside, on the hangar floor, anyone watching would have seen the black ship simply vanish, swallowed by the dark, as if it had never been there at all. Field is stable, Nair said. We are fully cloaked. Take us out, Torres, Cross said. Nice and slow. We've got a fleet to find. The nightshade slid out of the hangar without a sound, and without a single trace that it had ever existed. Behind it, the hangar doors closed again, and Ashfall Station returned to its quiet watch over a secret that only 200 people on Earth knew was real. 10 days remained before the Korath fleet reached Meridian Colony. Somewhere in the dark between the stars, an invisible ship had just begun its hunt, and the laughter in that cold meeting room felt very far away. 3 days into its journey, the Korath Third Fleet stopped at a small mining world called Kellex to take on fuel and supplies. Kellex was not a Korath world by birth. It had belonged to a species called the Fane, a quiet, small people who had never built a single warship in their history. The Dominion had conquered Kellex almost 80 years ago, and since then, the Fane had lived as workers under Korath rule, digging ore from their own moons, for masters who called them lucky to still be breathing. Grand Admiral Threk stood on the deck of his flagship, the Ravager, watching through a viewport as cargo ships moved between his fleet and the mines below. Beside him stood Dorn, the science officer, going over supply numbers on a datapad. Look at them, Threk said, nodding toward the small fine workers visible on a screen, loading crates onto a shuttle. Once they fought us with spears made of bone. Now they build our fuel lines and thank us for the chance to do it. They had no fleet to speak of, Dorn said carefully. The humans do. Threk waved a hand. 40 old patrol ships is not a fleet, Dorn. It is a joke. In 10 days, I will stand on their colony world and watch their governor beg the same way the fine elders begged 80 years ago. He smiled, showing too many teeth. It is always the same story. Every species thinks itself special, until the day it learns it is not. Dorn said nothing. He had learned long ago that arguing with Threk rarely ended well for the officer doing the arguing, but he could not stop thinking about the human ambassador's calm face during the meeting 3 days earlier. Frightened species begged. Species that thought they could still win, stayed calm, and made threats of their own. Webb had done neither. He had simply spoken like a man who already knew something Threk did not. That night, aboard the Ravager, the Korath officers held a small feast to celebrate the fleet's easy progress so far. Threk sat at the head of a long table, drinking a dark red liquid from a heavy cup, listening to his officers boast about what they would do once Meridian fell. One young officer, the same one who had laughed loudest during the meeting with Webb, suggested they should bring back a few humans alive, just to put on display back home, the way conquered species were sometimes shown as trophies of Dominion strength. Threk laughed at this, a deep, rough sound that shook his whole chest. Perhaps, he said, though I suspect there will not be much left of their little colony to bring back. A shame, in a way. I do enjoy a good trophy. Later in the evening, as the feast wound down and most of the junior officers had already retired to their quarters, Threk raised his cup once more, this time addressing the handful of senior staff still seated at the table. 200 years, he said. 200 years since the Dominion first looked at the stars and decided we would not simply live among them, we would own them. Every species that told us no eventually told us yes. The Dren, the Yultak, the Osrin, who thought their shields could not be broken until we broke them. He looked around at his officers, his black eyes catching the low light of the room. Humanity will be no different. In 10 days, their little colony will learn what every species before them has learned. Resistance only makes the lesson last longer. Vern raised his own cup out of duty rather than agreement and said nothing further that night. But as he walked back to his quarters afterward, he found himself thinking again of Ambassador Webb's calm, steady voice and the strange, quiet confidence of a species that had never once needed the Dominion's permission to exist. Not far from where Threk stood watching his cargo ships work, a young fine dock worker named Tamu guided a loading crane through its slow, careful motions, moving crates of refined ore toward a waiting Korath transport. Tamu had been born on Kelix, 3 years after the Dominion took control of the system. He had never seen the Fane flag his grandmother still kept folded in a drawer at home, never seen his people govern themselves, and never known anything but the quiet, careful movements required to avoid drawing the attention of Korath overseers. A Korath supervisor named Grath walked the docks that day, watching the loading with the bored expression of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. When one of the older Fane workers moved too slowly for his liking, Grath struck the ground near the worker's feet with the flat of his weapon, not to injure him, only to remind him that patience was a courtesy, not a right. Tamu kept his eyes on his crane controls and said nothing. His grandmother had taught him that surviving under the Dominion meant becoming very good at saying nothing. That evening, word passed quietly through the fine workers' quarters that the fleet resupplying at Kelix was headed for a new conquest, a species called humans, a small young species with only a handful of worlds to their name. Some of the older Fane, who remembered what it had been like before the Dominion came, felt something they rarely allowed themselves to feel anymore. A small, cautious hope that somewhere out there, someone might actually stand a chance. Most of them kept that hope to themselves, the same way they kept everything else to themselves. Hope, like everything, was safer when no one else could see it. Far behind the fleet, well outside the range of any Korath sensor, a much smaller ship moved through the same star lanes. Inside the nightshade, the mood was very different. There was no feast, no boasting, only the quiet hum of instruments and the soft glow of screens in a dimly lit cockpit. Captain Cross sat in her chair, studying a slow trickle of data that Lieutenant Torres had gathered from the Korath fleet's engine trails. 312 ships, give or take, Torres reported. Big ones in the center, smaller escort ships spread out around the edges like a shield. Any sign they've noticed us? Cross asked. None, Dr. Nair said from her station. The shadow field is holding steady. As long as we keep our distance and don't do anything foolish, we should stay a ghost to them the whole way. Commander Park leaned back in his seat, arms crossed. It's strange, watching a fleet that big and knowing they have no idea we exist. Get used to it, Cross said. That's the whole plan. Nair pulled up a display showing the shadow field's power levels, a long curved line that dipped and rose gently as the system worked. I should explain something, Captain, in case it matters later. The field isn't magic. It bends light around the hull, so anyone looking at us with their eyes, or with most kinds of sensors, sees only the space behind us, as if we weren't there at all. But it takes a huge amount of power to keep that bending steady, more than our weapons and engines combined. And if we fire a weapon? Park asked, though he already knew the answer. He had asked it a dozen times during training. Then, for about 6 seconds, the field weakens while power shifts to the guns, Nair said. We won't become fully visible, but at close range, with the right sensors, a sharp-eyed enemy might catch a flicker. A shadow where there shouldn't be one. 6 seconds, Cross repeated. That's our window every time we take a shot. 6 seconds, where we're not perfectly hidden. 6 seconds is enough time for someone to shoot back, if they're close and paying attention, Nair said. The cockpit was quiet for a moment. Everyone on board understood what that meant. Every attack the Nightshade made would carry a small risk, not of being seen for certain, but of being noticed just enough to draw unwanted attention at the worst possible time. Then we make sure nobody is close enough. Or paying attention closely enough. When we take our shots, Cross said. We hit ships that are alone. We hit them fast. And we hit their communications first, so no one can call for help before it's too late. Then we disappear again, before anyone even knows to look. For the next 2 days, the Nightshade trailed the Korath fleet at a careful distance, close enough to gather information, far enough to stay safe. Torres mapped the fleet's formation, noting which ships flew alone on patrol and which stayed tucked safely inside the main group. Park studied weapons data on Korath ship designs, looking for weak points. Their reactor cores are the key, he told Cross during one of their daily briefings, pulling up a rough schematic built from old intelligence reports and the fresh data Torres had gathered. Korath warships route almost all their power through a single central core, even the big cruisers. Efficient, but it means one solid hit in the right place does a lot more damage than it should. Most navies spread that risk across several smaller systems. The Dominion never had to. Nobody's ever hit them hard enough to teach them why that's a bad idea. So a precise shot beats a powerful one, Cross said. Every time, Park said, which works out well for us, since precise is exactly what a quiet ship with limited firing windows needs to be anyway. Nair kept a constant watch on the shadow field's power curve, adjusting settings by tiny amounts to keep it stable over such a long, slow flight. On the 5th day, they nearly made a fatal mistake. A single Korath patrol ship, faster and smaller than the rest of the fleet, broke away from the main group to sweep a wide patrol loop, the kind of routine safety check most large fleets performed out of habit rather than real suspicion. It came closer to the Nightshade's position than any ship had come so far, close enough that Torres had to cut engine power entirely and let the ship drift in silence, hoping the patrol vessel's sensors would find nothing but empty space. It's slowing down, Torres whispered, as if the enemy pilot might somehow hear him through the vacuum of space. Everyone hold still, Cross said quietly. Nair, minimum power to everything except the field. Nair's hands moved fast and sure across her console. Lights dimmed throughout the ship. The hum of the engines faded to almost nothing. On the main screen, a small icon representing the Korath patrol ship crept closer, then paused, hanging in space less than 2,000 kilometers away. A distance that would have been nothing at all for a normal ship to detect at. Seconds passed like hours. Park's hand rested near his console, ready to act if the worst happened, though everyone on board knew that firing now, at this distance, before they were ready, would be close to suicide. Then, slowly, the patrol ship began to move again, curving away on its patrol loop, its sensors finding nothing worth reporting. The Nightshade had not moved, had not made a sound, had not so much as blinked, and the patrol ship simply continued on, unaware of how close it had come to a ship it did not know existed. Nobody spoke for almost a full minute after the patrol ship's icon faded from their close-range sensors. Okay, Cross said finally, letting out a slow breath. New rule. From now on, we give every patrol ship twice the distance we think we need. We are not doing that again. Agreed, Nair said, her voice a little shaky. Later, after the adrenaline of the close call had faded into the ordinary quiet of another long shift, Torres found Park in the small galley, nursing a cup of something that was technically coffee, though nobody aboard the Nightshade would have called it good coffee. Can I ask you something? Torres said, dropping into the seat across from him. Go ahead. Why'd you transfer here? You had a good record on the destroyer. Real ship, real crew, real chance at making admiral someday if you wanted it. This. Torres gestured vaguely at the walls around them. This is 12 people on a ship most of the fleet still doesn't believe is real, doing a job nobody will ever know about even if we succeed. Park considered the question for a moment. My sister lives on a colony not much bigger than Meridian, he said finally. 6 years ago, a raider group hit a colony like hers. A small one. No real defenses. By the time a proper fleet arrived to help, there wasn't much left to save. I got there 2 days too late to matter, doing exactly the kind of straight-up fighting the fleet trains everyone for. He shrugged. When they told me about a ship that might get there before the shooting even started, instead of after, that was enough for me. Torres was quiet for a moment. I joined because I was the best pilot in my class, and somebody said I was too reckless for a normal command track, he admitted. Turns out reckless is exactly what you need to fly a ship that has to move slow and careful for 6 days straight, without a single mistake. Park allowed himself a small laugh at that, the first real laugh either of them had managed since the close call with the patrol ship. Reckless and patient. Strange combination. Story of my life, Torres said. Later still, Cross found Nair alone in the small engineering bay, running diagnostics on the shadow field, long after her shift should have ended. You should be resting, Cross said, leaning against the doorway. I will, Nair said, not looking up from her console. Just want to run one more check on the power regulators before I do. Cross stepped inside and took a seat on an empty equipment crate. You've run that check 4 times today. Nair allowed herself a small, tired smile. Guilty. Talk to me, Cross said. Not as your captain. Just talk to me. Nair was quiet for a moment, her hands finally still on the console. I built this system because my father spent 30 years designing sensor arrays for the fleet, she said. Better and better ways of seeing further, seeing clearer, finding anything that tried to hide from us. He used to say the whole history of war was a history of who could see the other side coming first. She shook her head slightly. I used to think building a better way to hide was the opposite of his life's work. Turns out it's the same idea, just facing the other direction. And now his daughter's built the best hiding place anyone's ever made, Cross said. Now his daughter is about to find out if 6 days of careful theory holds up against 300 warships that want to burn a colony to the ground, Nair said. I'd feel better if this were still just theory. Cross considered that for a moment. For what it's worth, I've read every test result twice. The field works. What I need from you now isn't perfection. It's honesty. If something's about to fail, I need to know before it fails, not after. You'll know, Nair said. I promise you that. Cross stood, resting a hand briefly on Nair's shoulder, before heading back toward the cockpit. Get some sleep, Priya. Even ghosts need rest. That night, if it could be called night, aboard a ship with no windows and no sun, Cross called her small crew together in the cramped common room near the back of the nightshade. 12 people sat or stood in a space barely large enough for all of them, but it was the only place aboard where the whole crew could gather at once. We have 5 days left before the fleet reaches Meridian, Cross said. We could wait until they arrive and try to strike everything at once, hoping speed and surprise carries us through. But I don't like those odds. 300 ships firing in every direction the moment they realize something is wrong gives us almost no room for error. What's the alternative? Park asked. We start now, Cross said, quietly. We pick off ships that fly alone, the scouts and patrol boats at the edges of the formation, one at a time, days apart if we have to, so it never looks like a pattern. By the time this fleet reaches Meridian, I want them confused, tired, and short, several ships they were counting on. I want Grand Admiral Threk arriving at that colony already looking over his shoulder. Nair raised a hand slightly. That means more decloak windows, more risk, spread out over more days instead of one big risk on one day. I know, Cross said, but a scared, distracted fleet is a fleet that makes mistakes. And mistakes are exactly what a ship like ours needs. She looked around at her crew, 12 tired faces in the dim light of the common room, each of them fully aware that they were about to start a fight that no one back home would ever be able to fully explain, even if they won. Get some rest if you can, Cross said. Tomorrow, we start hunting. On the 6th day of its journey, the Korath Third Fleet lost its first ship, though at first, nobody even noticed it was gone. The ship was a small scout vessel, flying a routine loop far ahead of the main fleet, to check for obstacles or debris in the flight path. It was the kind of duty considered so safe and boring that most crews treated it as a chance to rest, rather than truly watch their instruments. This time, the crew's rest cost them everything. The nightshade had been shadowing the scout for almost 6 hours, waiting for the right moment, a stretch of empty space, far from any other Korath ship, where a single flash of light or burst of static would draw no attention at all. Range, 400 kilometers, Torres said quietly, guiding the nightshade closer with tiny, careful bursts from the maneuvering thrusters. Closing to firing range in 90 seconds. Target their communications array first, Cross said, then the engines. We want them dead before they can send a single word. Park's hands moved over his weapons console, marking 2 precise points on the small scout ship's hull. Locked, he said. Ready on your order, Captain. Fire. The Nightshade's forward weapon released a narrow beam of focused energy, silent in the vacuum of space, striking the scout ship's communications dish before its crew even registered a warning on their instruments. A second beam followed less than a second later, tearing through the engine compartment. The scout ship went dark, drifting, its systems dead, its crew given no chance to call for help. For 6 long seconds, the Nightshade's shadow field flickered, weakened by the sudden demand on its power system. Then Nair's hands flew across her controls, and the field stabilized again, full power restored, the ship folding back into invisibility, as if it had never fired a shot at all. Target destroyed, Park confirmed. No transmission got out. Confirmed. Torres was already turning the ship away, easing back into the slow, careful drift that had carried them safely for 6 days. Behind them, the dead scout ship tumbled silently, a piece of debris among a million others in the dark, giving no clue at all about what had ended it. It took the Korath fleet almost 4 hours to notice the scout ship was overdue for its check-in. Grand Admiral Threk was informed during a routine briefing, and his first reaction was mild irritation rather than concern. Equipment failure, he said, waving a hand. Send a ship to check on them and get them moving again. The search ship found only wreckage, tumbling silently through the dark, and no answer to the question of what had destroyed it. An engine malfunction, Threk decided, when the report reached him, or perhaps they struck debris at speed. These things happen on long journeys. Log it and move on. Dorn, standing quietly at the back of the briefing room, said nothing, but he requested a copy of the wreckage scan for his own files. When he studied it later, alone in his quarters, he noticed something that troubled him deeply. The damage to the communications array looked clean, precise, almost surgical. Nothing like the messy destruction caused by a collision with debris at high speed. It looked, to his trained eye, like the kind of damage caused by a very accurate weapon. He said nothing to Threk, not yet. He did not have enough evidence, and a careful officer learned to gather proof before speaking, especially in a fleet where the Grand Admiral did not welcome theories he had not asked for. 2 days later, it happened again. This time, it was a pair of escort cruisers that had drifted slightly too far from the main formation while running a training exercise. The Nightshade struck them within minutes of each other, disabling communications first and then finishing both ships before either crew fully understood they were under attack. 6 more seconds of weakened cloak, twice over, and twice more the shadow field held just long enough. Aboard the Nightshade, the strike left the crew quiet and drained. Firing twice in such quick succession had pushed the shadow field harder than any single strike before it, and Nair had spent the following hour running checks on the power regulators, saying little, her face tight with concentration. She held, Nair finally said, when the last diagnostic came back clean. But that was closer to the edge than I'd like. Then we space these out better, Cross said. No more doubles unless we have no other choice. This time, the loss of 2 ships at once was harder to explain away as accident or equipment failure. Whispers began to spread through the fleet, quiet at first, growing louder in the mess halls and crew quarters, where officers were not present to silence them. Some sailors spoke of a ghost ship, an old story from Korath legend, about a vessel crewed by the restless dead of a defeated enemy, cursed to hunt down those who claimed unearned victories. Others simply said the humans must have some hidden weapon, though they said it quietly, afraid of being called cowards for suggesting the primitive humans could do anything the mighty Dominion could not counter. Fleet Captain Voth, one of Threk's senior officers, brought his concerns directly to the Grand Admiral during a private meeting on the Ravager's bridge. 3 ships lost in 4 days, all without warning, all destroyed with precision that does not match debris collisions or equipment failure, Voth said. I recommend we slow our approach, spread out escort patrols in wider search patterns, and investigate properly before continuing toward Meridian. Threk's eyes narrowed. You want me to slow the greatest fleet the Dominion has sent in a decade because of 3 lost patrol boats? I want us to understand what we are facing before it costs us more than 3 ships, Admiral. We are facing nothing, Threk said, his voice rising. We are facing bad luck, faulty equipment, and officers too eager to see monsters in empty space. Humanity has 40 broken-down patrol ships sitting at Meridian. That is the entire threat we face. Do you understand me, Captain Voth? Voth held his ground for a moment longer than was wise. With respect, Admiral, I do not think 3 destroyed ships is bad luck. Threk stood, his full height casting a shadow over the smaller officer. You are relieved of your command, effective immediately. Report to quarters, and consider yourself fortunate that I do not consider this insubordination during wartime, which carries a rather less comfortable punishment. Voth said nothing further. He saluted stiffly and left the bridge, and within an hour, every officer on the Ravager had heard what happened to the last person who questioned the Grand Admiral's judgment. The whispers about a ghost ship did not stop, but they grew quieter, kept to private conversations between trusted friends rather than official reports. Dorn watched all of this from his station near the back of the bridge and made another quiet note in his private files. 3 ships lost, an officer punished for asking reasonable questions, fleet morale weakening. If there truly is a hidden enemy, our own pride may do more damage than their weapons. In the crew decks of an escort cruiser called the Talon Reach, a young weapons technician named Vren lay awake in his bunk long after the ship's night cycle had begun, listening to the quiet hum of the engines and finding no comfort in it at all. A friend from his training class had served aboard one of the twin cruisers lost only days earlier. Vren had known him for 6 years. Now there was nothing left of him at all, not even a body to send home for proper rites. You awake? Whispered the sailor in the next bunk, an older gunner named Sask, who had served 3 tours before this one. Can't sleep, Vren admitted. Nobody can, anymore, Sask said quietly. You hear the stories going around. Some say it's the old legend, the Hollow Fleet, come back to punish us for something. Others say it's a weapon. I don't know which scares me more. The Grand Admiral says it's bad luck, Vren said, though he did not sound like he believed it. Sask was quiet for a long moment. The Grand Admiral has never lost 5 ships to bad luck in 10 days in his entire career, he said finally. Get some rest if you can, Vren. Whatever's out there, worrying about it in the dark isn't going to change what happens tomorrow. Neither of them slept well that night, and neither said so out loud, because on a fleet where questioning command had already cost 1 officer his rank, silence had become the safest thing anyone could offer. Alone in his own quarters that same night, Dorn pulled up every scrap of data he had gathered since the first scout ship went missing. 5 separate incidents, 5 patterns of damage that all pointed to the same conclusion. A single, precise weapon, striking communications first, then a critical system, always against isolated targets, always without warning. He built a rough timeline, marking each incident against the fleet's position at the time. Every strike had occurred at the edges of the formation, never at its heart, and always against ships that had, for one reason or another, drifted just far enough from support to be vulnerable. It was not the pattern of bad luck. It was the pattern of a hunter, patient and careful, picking off exactly the targets it could take safely and leaving the rest alone. Whoever, or whatever, was doing this, understood risk in a way that suggested intelligence, not chance. Dorn considered bringing his findings to Threk one more time, then thought better of it. Voth had brought evidence and lost his command for the trouble. Dorn decided, for now, to simply keep watching, keep recording, and wait for a moment when the Grand Admiral might finally be willing to listen. Aboard the Nightshade, the mood was tense but focused. Several strikes over several days had left the crew running on short bursts of sleep, between long stretches of careful, silent tracking. But the numbers told a story Cross found encouraging, even if nobody else would ever know to count it. 5 ships down, Park reported, updating the tally on his console. 3 destroyed outright. 2 more disabled badly enough that they've fallen out of formation and turned back toward Korath territory for repairs. And no sign they've identified us as the cause, Nair added. Whatever theories they're forming, none of the fleet's sensor logs show anything resembling our ship. Cross allowed herself a small measure of satisfaction, though she knew better than to grow careless. Keep it that way. We have 2 days left before this fleet reaches Meridian. I want at least 1 or 2 more ships gone before they arrive, if we can find safe opportunities. Nothing risky. We've come too far to get greedy now. And after they arrive? Torres asked. Once the shooting starts for real, hiding gets a lot harder. Everyone's watching everything at once. Cross nodded slowly. She had already spent long hours thinking about exactly that problem. Once they reach Meridian, our job changes. We stop picking off stragglers and start hitting the heart of their formation, right when the human defense fleet engages them. In the middle of a real battle, with weapons firing from every ship in every direction, one more flash of light from an unexpected angle is a lot easier to lose in the noise. So we hide inside the chaos, Park said. We hide inside the chaos, Cross agreed, and we make sure the chaos works in our favor, not theirs. Creddy. The supply tender came next, caught briefly alone while ferrying cargo between two escort groups during a routine resupply run. It was a slow, unarmed vessel, carrying spare parts and rations rather than weapons, but even unarmed ships carried crews, and every ship removed from the Korath formation was one less set of eyes that might eventually piece together the truth. She's alone, Torres reported, watching the tender's slow, predictable course on his display. No escort within 400 kilometers in any direction. This is about as clean as it gets. Cross studied the tactical display a moment longer. Take the shot. Park's weapon fired twice in quick succession. Communications first, then the tender's modest engine core. The ship went dark and drifted, exactly as the others had, and the nightshade slipped away into the black before anyone else in the fleet had any reason to look in their direction. A day later, a Korath destroyer, investigating what its sensors insisted was a stray signal, actually a faint echo Nair had quietly bounced off a distant asteroid to draw it away from the main formation, found itself alone in exactly the kind of empty space the nightshade had been waiting for. The destroyer never learned that the signal it chased had never been real at all. Both strikes went cleanly. Both added to a tally that Grand Admiral Threk still refused to see as anything more than a run of bad luck, even as his officers grew quieter, and his fleet grew warier, and the whispers about a ghost in the dark grew harder for anyone to fully silence. On Meridian, the 10 days had not passed quietly. Governor Kessler had spent every waking hour since the ultimatum coordinating what limited defenses the colony could muster. Evacuation ships ran constant routes between the surface and a handful of deep shelters built decades earlier, for reasons no one had ever expected to actually need, back when the colony was founded and its planners had, out of caution rather than fear, insisted on building somewhere safe to hide, in case the sky ever turned hostile. Nobody had truly believed they would ever be used. Shelter capacity is at 80%, an aide reported during one of the daily briefings. We can get most of the farming communities under cover in time, assuming the Korath fleet arrives on schedule and gives us the full 10 days. And if they arrive early? Kessler asked. Nobody had a good answer for that, so nobody offered one. General Okafor spent his days drilling what defense fleet he had, running every simulation his tactical officers could design, though every simulation ended the same discouraging way. 40 ships, even with the 58 reinforcements that had begun arriving from Earth 2 days into the crisis, could not defeat 300. The math simply did not allow for a different answer, no matter how many times anyone ran it. We're not fighting to win, Okafor told his officers plainly, during a briefing on the 9th day, as sensor reports began confirming the Korath fleet's approach toward the system's outer edge. We're fighting to buy time. Every ship we keep in the fight is another few minutes for evacuation transports to clear the surface. That is the whole mission. Hold the line as long as we can, and get as many people off this world as we can, for as long as we can. His officers nodded, grim and quiet, none of them mentioning the odds out loud, because everyone in that room already understood them perfectly well. That night, Governor Kessler stood alone on the balcony of her office, looking up at a sky that still looked perfectly ordinary, still full of the same stars that had always hung there, giving no hint at all of the fleet now crossing into the outer edge of her system. She thought of Ambassador Webb's report from 10 days earlier, the one line that had stayed with her since she first read it. Humanity is not asking for your permission. She hoped, more than she had hoped for almost anything in her life, that somewhere out there, humanity had a plan she simply did not know about yet. She was right to hope. She simply had no way of knowing how right. On the 10th day, the Korath Third Fleet crossed into the outer edge of the Meridian system, their sensors picking up the first faint signals of the small human colony ahead. Farm broadcasts, school transmissions, the ordinary noise of 2 million people living their ordinary lives, entirely unaware of just how close their final hours might be. Grand Admiral Threk stood on the Ravager's bridge, watching the system map fill in ahead of them. The fifth planet in the system, a green and blue world called Meridian, and the small cluster of 40 defense ships gathered in orbit around it, a force so small on the display that it barely registered as more than a handful of dots. "There they are," Threk said, a note of satisfaction creeping into his voice. "Their whole mighty fleet, waiting to die for a colony they cannot possibly save." He did not mention the 7 ships his fleet had lost since leaving home, nor the whispers still moving quietly through his crew decks, nor the small, careful notes a certain science officer kept adding to his private files. Pride, Dorn had come to understand over the last 10 days, could be its own kind of blindness, and Grand Admiral Threk wore his pride like armor, even as cracks began to show beneath it. Behind the Korath fleet, unseen, unheard, and utterly unknown to any sensor aboard any Korath ship, the Nightshade slipped quietly into the system alongside them, carrying 12 tired but determined humans, and a plan that Grand Admiral Threk could not have imagined even in his worst nightmares. The Korath Third Fleet arrived at Meridian in full battle formation, 307 warships spreading out across the system like a slow, deliberate net closing around its prey. Grand Admiral Threk opened a single broadcast channel to the planet below, his voice carrying the same cold confidence he had shown 10 days earlier, in a meeting room that now felt like it belonged to a different lifetime. "People of Meridian," his voice boomed across every open channel on the planet, "you have been given your chance to surrender. That chance has passed. Lay down your weapons now, and some of you may yet be permitted to serve the Dominion. Resist, and you will share the fate of every world that has ever doubted us." On the planet below, in a command bunker beneath Meridian's capital city, Governor Kessler listened to the broadcast beside General Okafor, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Options?" she asked. "We fight," Okafor said simply. "Our 40 ships, plus the 58 reinforcements that arrived from Earth. 98 ships total, against over 300. We won't win a straight battle, but we can make them bleed for every hour they spend here, and every hour is an hour more for evacuation ships to get civilians off the surface." "Then that is what we do," Kessler said. There was no other choice worth considering, and both of them knew it. The human defense fleet moved to intercept the Korath advance at the edge of the system, a desperate line of 98 ships against more than 3 times their number. Leading one section of that line was Captain Ilana Reyes, commanding a mid-sized cruiser called the Valiant, one of the reinforcement ships that had arrived from Earth just in time to join the fight. "Hold formation," Reyes ordered over the fleet-wide channel, as the two forces closed the distance between them. "We are not here to win today. We are here to make sure there's a tomorrow for the people down there." The battle began with a storm of long-range missile fire from both sides, streaks of light crossing the dark of space, as ships on both sides opened fire at maximum range. Within the first 10 minutes, 3 human ships were lost, torn apart by the sheer weight of Korath firepower, while the human fleet's return fire managed to cripple only a single Korath escort ship in response. The numbers were exactly as grim as Okafor had predicted, and everyone in that battle line understood they were fighting a battle they could only lose slowly, not win. One of those 3 ships was the light cruiser Fortitude, under the command of a young officer named Captain Diego Alvarez, barely 30 years old and leading his first real combat command. The Fortitude took 3 direct hits within the span of a minute, her shields failing, her hull breached in a dozen places. Rather than break off and retreat, Alvarez held his position, using the dying ship's remaining weapons to cover an evacuation convoy of unarmed transports racing to clear the system's outer edge. "All hands, abandon ship," Alvarez ordered over the fleet channel, his voice steady, even as alarms screamed behind him. "Convoy 7, you're clear to continue. We'll hold as long as we can." The Fortitude held for 90 more seconds before a final hit tore through her reactor core, ending her and the handful of crew who had stayed at their posts to keep her weapons firing. Convoy 7 made it clear of the battle, carrying 412 evacuees toward the safety of a jump point beyond the system's edge. It was a trade that Okafor, watching from his own flagship, would carry with him long after the battle ended. One more debt on a list that was growing longer by the minute. On the surface, in a farming town not far from Meridian's capital, a woman named Elsa Ferreira herded her 2 children toward a waiting transport, one small bag slung over her shoulder holding everything she had decided, in the space of a frantic hour, that they could not live without. Above them, the sky flickered with distant light, the kind of light that used to mean nothing more than a passing meteor, now carrying a meaning none of them wanted to think about too closely. "Are the soldiers going to win?" her older child asked, gripping her hand tightly as they boarded the transport. Elsa did not know the answer, and she had promised herself, somewhere in that frantic hour, that she would not lie to her children about things that mattered. "I don't know," she said honestly. "But they're buying us time to get somewhere safe. That's what matters right now." Around her, dozens of other families crowded into the same transport, farmers and shopkeepers and teachers, who, 10 days earlier, had never imagined needing to know the location of their nearest deep shelter. The transport lifted off amid a chorus of frightened children and quietly determined parents, one small piece of the desperate, hour-by-hour effort to save as much of Meridian as could be saved, while far above them, a battle none of them could see raged on in the dark. Aboard the Nightshade, hidden somewhere in the chaos of the opening exchange, Captain Cross watched the battle unfold on her tactical display, a wash of red and blue icons marking ships, weapons fire, and the slow, grinding math of a battle tilted heavily against her side. "Now," she said quietly, "this is our moment. Park. Target their capital ships, the big cruisers holding the center of their formation. Every one of them we take down is fewer guns pointed at our people down there." "Understood, Captain," Park said, already marking targets on his console. "First target locked. A heavy cruiser, 300 meters off our port side. Fire." The Nightshade's weapon lanced out silently, striking the cruiser's main reactor with pinpoint precision, exactly where Park's days of study had told him to aim. The ship's core overloaded within seconds, a bright flash of light and fire consuming the vessel from the inside out, an explosion that, from the outside, looked like nothing more than an unlucky hit from the general chaos of battle. No one aboard any nearby Korath ship could see what had actually fired the shot. There was simply an enemy weapon that seemed to come from empty space, followed by one less cruiser in their formation. For the next 20 minutes, the Nightshade moved like a silent knife through the heart of the Korath fleet, striking capital ships one after another, always from unexpected angles, always vanishing again within the 6-second window before the shadow field could stabilize. Torres flew with a precision that surprised even himself, weaving the ship through gaps in Korath formations that most pilots would never have dared attempt. Trusting his instruments completely, since his eyes showed him nothing but stars and the distant flashes of a battle he could not fully see. The second target was a destroyer escorting a group of troop transports, its crew still scanning nervously for a threat they could not define even as Park's shot found their reactor from an angle no defense screen had been built to expect. The third was a cruiser that made the mistake of drifting only slightly out of formation to avoid a piece of drifting wreckage. A small, ordinary decision that put it just far enough from support for the Nightshade to strike cleanly and vanish again before anyone nearby could react. Each strike left the same 6-second window of vulnerability, and each time, Nair's hands moved with practiced speed to stabilize the field before that window became a liability. By the fourth strike, sweat had begun to bead on her forehead despite the cool air of the ship's systems, the strain of holding a system built for careful, isolated shots, now under the pressure of rapid, repeated use during a live battle. "4 down," Park reported, his voice tight with focus rather than excitement, moving to 5th target. "Nair, talk to me," Cross said, without taking her eyes off the display. "Holding," Nair said. "Barely, but holding." On the Ravager's bridge, Grand Admiral Threk watched his formation crumble, with an expression that shifted, minute by minute, from confidence to confusion, to something that looked uncomfortably close to fear. "Report," he demanded, as another cruiser exploded on the main display, seemingly without cause. "What is destroying my ships?" "Unknown, Admiral," a sensor officer replied, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. We have no weapons fire detected before the explosions. No enemy contacts on any scanner. It's as though the ships are simply dying. Ships do not simply die, Threk roared. Find me the source of this attack, now. Dorn, standing at his usual station near the back of the bridge, felt a cold certainty settle over him as he watched the pattern of destruction unfold on his own screens. Every ship lost so far had been isolated, even slightly, from its neighbors at the moment of its destruction. Every explosion had begun at a reactor or engine core, the kind of precise strike that came from a weapon, not an accident, and not the wide, sweeping damage of normal fleet combat. Admiral, Dorn said, stepping forward despite every instinct telling him this was exactly the kind of moment that had gotten Voth removed from command just days earlier. I believe we are facing a single enemy vessel, using some form of concealment technology, beyond anything in our records. The pattern of losses is consistent with one attacker striking isolated targets, not a fleet action. Threk turned to him, eyes blazing. One ship? You believe one human ship is destroying my fleet? I believe the evidence supports that conclusion. Yes, Admiral. For a moment, Threk looked as though he might have Dorn removed from the bridge entirely, but something in the science officer's steady, careful tone, combined with the mounting wreckage on the tactical display. If there is one ship doing this, Threk said slowly, then find it. Spread our sensor net wider. Order every ship to fire on any anomaly, any shadow, any reading that does not match known space. I want this ghost found and destroyed. The order went out across the fleet, and for a short time, the Korath formation grew more cautious, more spread out, ships firing nervously at empty patches of space, where sensors flickered with even the faintest hint of an anomaly. It made the Nightshades work harder, forcing Cross and her crew to wait longer between strikes, choosing their moments with even greater care. But it also meant the Korath fleet, already reeling from unexplained losses, grew slower and more disorganized, ships breaking formation to chase shadows that were never really there, opening gaps that the human defense fleet was quick to exploit. Their formation is falling apart, General Okafor reported from his own flagship, watching the battle with something between disbelief and desperate hope. I don't know what's happening over there, but they're firing on empty space and breaking ranks. Reyes, push your group through that gap on their left flank, now, while they're distracted. Copy that, Reyes answered, already turning the Valiant and its escort ships toward the widening hole in the Korath line. Let's make them pay for whatever's got them so spooked. The Valiant led 4 other cruisers through the gap, catching a cluster of Korath support ships completely off guard. In the space of a few minutes, Reyes's small strike group destroyed 2 supply vessels and crippled a troop transport before Korath ships further back in the formation could react and force them to withdraw. It was a small victory in a battle still tilted heavily against the humans, but it was the first moment since the fighting began that felt like anything other than a slow, losing retreat. On his own flagship, General Okafor watched with growing disbelief as more Korath capital ships fell to no attack his own sensors could detect. He had received no official word of any additional asset beyond his own fleet and the reinforcements from Earth, but the pattern was too clear, too deliberate, to be anything but design. Sir, his tactical officer said carefully, I don't know what's happening to their center formation, but it isn't us. Every explosion is a clean hit, straight to the reactor. That's not debris. That's not a lucky shot from our own guns. Someone else is fighting this battle with us. Okafor allowed himself a small, tired breath, somewhere between disbelief and something close to hope. Whoever they are, he said quietly, keep the pressure on our end. If someone's out there fighting for us, the least we can do is make sure we're still standing when they're done. He did not know about Ashfall Station, or the Nightshade, or the 12 tired humans hidden somewhere in the chaos of his own battle. He only knew that for the first time in 10 desperate days, the numbers had finally, impossibly, begun to shift. By the time 2 hours had passed since the battle began, the Korath Third Fleet had lost 41 ships, more than half of them to a cause their own sensors could not identify, and the survivors were flying in a formation that could no longer be called organized by any reasonable standard. The human defense fleet had lost 22 ships of its own, a terrible cost, but far lower than the devastating losses Okafor had originally feared. and every hour bought was another hour for evacuation ships to carry civilians safely away from the surface below. Aboard the Ravager, Grand Admiral Threk stood amid a bridge crew that had grown noticeably quieter, more nervous, watching their instruments with the wide-eyed focus of people who no longer trusted what those instruments told them. "Status," Threk demanded. "We have lost contact with over 60 ships, Admiral," the sensor officer reported, his voice barely steady. 41 confirmed destroyed, the rest scattered or fled from the formation. The human fleet has broken through our left flank and is pushing toward our support ships. Threk's hands tightened on the edge of his command console. For the first time since the meeting with Ambassador Webb, 10 days and what felt like a lifetime ago, something that might have been doubt flickered behind his small black eyes. "This is not possible," he said quietly, almost to himself. One ship, one human ship, doing this to an entire fleet. Dorn, standing nearby, said nothing. He did not need to say, "I told you so." The wreckage scattered across the system said it for him. By the time the tally reached 41 confirmed losses, Threk had abandoned any pretense of continuing the assault on Meridian's defense fleet directly. His voice, when he gave the order, carried none of the confidence it had held just hours earlier. "Pull every remaining ship back around the flagship," he commanded. "Full defensive formation. We hold position until we understand what we are facing, or until reinforcements arrive from Dominion space." It was, Dorn thought privately, the first genuinely cautious decision he had seen the Grand Admiral make in 10 days, and it had come only after losing dozens of ships to an enemy that, as far as Threk's own instruments could tell, did not exist. Aboard the Nightshade, Cross watched the tactical display with grim focus, tracking the Ravager's position at the center of what remained of the Korath formation. Most of the escort ships were gone now, destroyed, fled, or too badly damaged to fight. The flagship sat increasingly alone, its remaining defenders scattered thin around it. "Nair, how are we holding up?" Cross asked. "The field is stressed," Nair admitted, watching her power readings with a frown. "We've fired more times today than in all our previous tests combined." "She's holding, but I won't lie to you, Captain. We're pushing this system harder than it was ever designed for." "Can she hold for one more strike? The big one?" Nair was quiet for a moment. Then she nodded. "One more, I think. After that, I honestly don't know." Cross looked at the tactical display, at the lone shape of the Ravager sitting near the center of a fleet that had once numbered over 300 ships, and now barely mustered 60, scattered and disorganized around their wounded flagship. "Then let's make it count," she said. "Set a course for the Ravager. It's time to end this." Around them, the battle raged on, human ships and Korath ships trading fire across a system that, 10 days earlier, had known only the quiet routine of farms and schools and a modest starport that saw 3 ships a week. Now that same system was filled with wreckage, and somewhere in the middle of it, 12 tired humans in an invisible ship were closing in on the last piece that could end it all. The Nightshade closed on the Ravager slowly, carefully, every meter of the approach a careful balance between speed and silence. Around the flagship, the remaining Korath escort ships, perhaps 60 out of an original force of more than 300, had pulled into a tight defensive ring, weapons scanning constantly for any sign of the enemy that had torn their fleet apart from the inside. Grand Admiral Threk stood on the Ravager's bridge, watching the wreckage of his once great fleet drift silently around him on the tactical display. Hours ago, he had commanded the largest force the Korath Dominion had sent to war in a decade. Now he commanded a wounded remnant, hiding behind a defensive screen against an enemy he could not see, could not find, and until very recently, had not even believed existed. "Order every ship to hold position around the flagship," he said, his voice quieter now than it had been during the meeting with Ambassador Webb. "No one moves, no one fires unless they have a confirmed target. We wait for reinforcements from Dominion space." "Reinforcements are 11 days away at best speed, Admiral," an officer reported. Threk said nothing. 11 days felt like a very long time, when an invisible enemy had already destroyed most of his fleet in a single afternoon. Beside him, Dorn stood quietly, watching the same wreckage on his own display. Part of him wanted to feel vindicated. Mostly, he simply felt tired, and a little afraid, in the way anyone might feel standing near the center of something enormous and unfinished. "You were right," Threk said, without looking at him. It was as close to an apology as Dorn expected he would ever hear from the Grand Admiral. "I take no pleasure in it, sir," Dorn said, and found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he meant it. Aboard the Nightshade, Dr. Nair's console blinked with a warning she had been dreading since the battle began. "Captain, the field is destabilizing," she said, her voice tight. "We've asked too much of it today. I can give you one clean shot at the flagship, but after that, I cannot promise the field will hold steady. There's a real chance we become visible, even without firing again." Cross absorbed this without flinching, though the weight of it settled heavily in her chest. 12 people, 1 irreplaceable ship, and 60 enemy vessels surrounding their target, all of them ready to fire on the first sign of anything unusual. "Understood," she said. "Then we make the one shot count, and we get out immediately after, whatever happens." Getting close enough for a clean shot on their flagship, through that defensive ring, is not going to be easy, Torres said, studying the tight formation surrounding the Ravager on his own display. "They've packed those escort ships in tight. There's maybe one gap wide enough for us to slip through without brushing against another hull." "Then find it," Cross said. "Slow and steady. We have time. What we don't have is a second chance if we rush this." For the next 20 minutes, Torres guided the Nightshade through the narrowest of gaps in the Korath defensive ring, a path that required threading between 2 escort cruisers with barely more than a few hundred meters of clearance on either side, moving at a crawl that tested every ounce of his considerable skill. Nobody on the bridge spoke. Every breath felt too loud. Every small correction Torres made to their course felt like it might be the one that finally gave them away. Once, a Korath escort ship drifted closer than expected, correcting its position within its own defensive line, and for 3 long seconds, its course looked as though it might cross directly into the Nightshade's path. Torres held perfectly still, cutting power to a bare minimum, and the escort ship corrected its drift and settled back into formation, never knowing how close it had come to a collision with a ship it could not see. Midway through the approach, a sensor sweep from one of the nearer escort ships washed briefly over the Nightshade's hull, and for one heart-stopping moment, every reading on Nair's console spiked as the shadow field strained to compensate. "Hold," Cross whispered, though Torres was already holding, every muscle in his body locked in place as he waited to see whether the sweep would linger or move on. It moved on. The escort ship's sensors found nothing worth flagging, and its course continued along its patrol loop as though nothing at all had happened. Nair let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, watching her readings settle back toward normal. "That's twice today. I've aged 5 years," she muttered, half to herself. "Get in line," Park said quietly, without looking away from his own console. At last, the Nightshade drifted into position less than 1,000 kilometers from the Ravager itself, close enough now that Park could see the flagship's hull details clearly on his targeting display, close enough that a single mistake by anyone aboard would mean instant discovery. "Target locked," Park whispered, as if a normal voice might somehow carry across the vacuum of space and betray them. "Their main reactor, same as the others. One good hit should finish her." Cross studied the display a moment longer. 4 years building this ship from nothing more than an idea, and it all came down to this single shot, fired at an enemy who still did not fully believe such a shot was even possible. "Do it," she said. The Nightshade's weapon fired one final time, a silent beam of focused energy crossing the last 1,000 kilometers in less than a second, striking the Ravager's reactor core with the same precision that had ended dozens of ships before it that day. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the entire aft section of the Ravager lit up from within, a bright, terrible light spreading through the ship's structure as its reactor tore itself apart, section by section, faster than any damage control system could hope to contain. On the bridge of the dying flagship, alarms screamed as Grand Admiral Threk was thrown from his command chair by the force of the first explosion. Around him, officers scrambled toward escape pods, the careful order of moments before collapsing into desperate chaos. Threk pulled himself upright against a console that sparked and smoked beside him, staring at a viewport that showed nothing but empty space. The same empty space that had somehow, impossibly, destroyed his entire fleet. "Show yourself," he said, to no one, to nothing, to the empty dark beyond the glass. "Show yourself, coward, whatever you are." There was, of course, no answer. The nightshade was already pulling away, Torres guiding her carefully back through the gap in the ring, before the Ravager's death throes could draw every remaining escort ship's full attention toward their position. Nair watched her power readings with white-knuckled focus, the shadow field flickering dangerously at the edges, but somehow, just barely, holding steady. Behind them, the Ravager broke apart entirely, a final flash of light and debris marking the end of Grand Admiral Threk and the great flagship he had commanded with such confidence just hours earlier. Dorn, thrown from his feet by the same blast, was pulled into an escape pod by two junior officers, moments before the bridge lost pressure entirely, one of the very few aboard the flagship's command deck to survive the night. Without their flagship, without their admiral, and having watched more than 2/3 of their fleet destroyed by an enemy they could never see, the remaining Korath ships did not hesitate. Within minutes, every surviving vessel broke away and fled toward the safety of Dominion space, abandoning the battle, abandoning Meridian, and abandoning any hope of the easy conquest they had expected just 10 days earlier. On the planet below, General Okafor watched the retreating Korath ships on his own tactical display, with an expression of exhausted disbelief. "They're running," he said quietly, almost afraid to say it too loudly, as though speaking the words might somehow undo them. "Confirm that. Confirm they're actually running." "Confirm, General," his sensor officer replied, her voice shaking slightly. "All remaining Korath vessels have broken formation and are retreating at maximum speed. They are leaving the system." Captain Reyes, still holding position near what remained of the human battle line aboard the battered Valiant, allowed herself a long, slow breath as the reports came in. Of the 98 ships that had gone into that battle, only 51 remained fit to fly, and she had lost friends she would carry with her for the rest of her life. But the planet below was still there, and the people on it were still alive, and on a day when the odds had promised her almost nothing, that felt like enough to hold on to. In the command bunker beneath Meridian's capital, Governor Kessler closed her eyes for a long moment, feeling something like relief settle over her for the first time in 10 days. Above her, through the city's speakers, word was already spreading among the 2 million people who had spent the last hours huddled in shelters, waiting to learn whether they would still have a home by morning. They would. That evening, as evacuation transports began the long process of returning families to homes many had feared they would never see again, Meridian held no grand celebration. The cost had been too real for that. 231 human sailors had died defending a colony of farmers and shopkeepers who would likely never know most of their names. Instead, church bells rang quietly across the capital, and in town squares throughout the colony, people gathered simply to stand together for a while, saying little, grateful in the plain, exhausted way people are grateful after surviving something they had genuinely expected to lose. General Okafor visited the injured in Meridian's main hospital that night, moving slowly down rows of cots, offering what comfort he could to sailors who had given up ships, and, in some cases, crewmates, to buy 2 million strangers a few more hours of safety. He did not yet know why the Korath fleet had fallen apart so completely in those final hours, and he suspected he might never learn the full story. But he understood, standing in that hospital, that whatever had happened out there, it had been bought and paid for by both sides, human and hidden, working together without either side fully aware of the other's presence until the very end. 3 days later, at a quiet, unmarked hangar deep inside Ashfall Station, the Nightshade returned home. There was no parade waiting for her, no crowd of cheering officers, no public announcement of what her crew had done. The program remained exactly as secret as it had been before the battle, known only to the same 200 people who had always known it existed. But inside that hangar, Admiral Ruiz was waiting personally, along with Fleet Admiral Whitfield, who had traveled all the way from Earth to see the ship return with her own eyes. Captain Cross walked down the boarding ramp on legs that felt unsteady after 3 days without proper rest, her uniform still marked with the small signs of a battle fought entirely from the inside of a cramped cockpit. Behind her came Park, Nair, Torres, and the rest of the crew. 12 tired people who had just quietly ended the greatest threat humanity had faced since first reaching the stars. 289 Korath ships, destroyed or disabled, Whitfield said, reading from a report Ruiz had prepared during the journey back. Out of an original fleet of 307, their Grand Admiral dead, their surviving ships in full retreat, and Meridian colony fully intact, 2 million civilians safe. The defense fleet did most of that work, ma'am, Cross said. We just made their job possible. Whitfield studied her for a long moment. Captain, I have read every report from this battle twice. Your ship destroyed or disabled more than half of that fleet single-handedly, without ever once being detected. I think you can allow yourself to accept some credit for that. Ruiz, standing a step behind Whitfield, allowed himself something he rarely permitted while on duty. A genuine, unguarded smile. 4 years, he said. 4 years of budget hearings, skeptical admirals, and engineers telling me this was impossible. I believed in this program, Captain, but I'll admit, there were nights I wondered if I was simply a man who had bet everything on a good idea that would never actually work in the real world. And now? Cross asked. Now I think we should start building a second one, Ruiz said, because I have a feeling the Korath will not be the last empire to make the mistake of laughing at us. Far beyond Meridian, in the scattered wreckage still drifting through that quiet system, word of what had happened was already beginning to spread in whispers among traders, smugglers, and the crews of a dozen other species who had business passing through that stretch of space. The stories grew stranger and larger with each retelling, as stories always do. Some claimed the humans had a fleet of ghost ships. Others insisted it was only ever one vessel, though most found that version harder to believe, even though it happened to be true. Within the Korath Dominion itself, the destruction of the Third Fleet sent a quiet shockwave through a government that had grown used to easy victories over the past 2 centuries. On Kelix, word reached the mining docks within a few weeks, carried quietly by a supply pilot who had heard it from someone else, besides. A young dock worker named Tamu heard the story while loading crates alongside his grandmother, who had lived long enough to remember a time before the Dominion came. 300 ships, Tamu said quietly, when he was sure no Korath overseer stood close enough to hear. Beaten by something the humans call one invisible warship. His grandmother said nothing for a long moment, her hands still on the crate in front of her. 80 years, she said finally. I have told myself that this is simply how the universe is, that the strong take, and the rest of us learn to carry what they leave behind. She looked up at the sky, where the same stars hung that had always hung there. Perhaps I was wrong to believe that so completely. She did not say anything more than that, not there, not with Korath overseers still walking the docks. But the story of Meridian traveled further than the Dominion would ever be comfortable admitting, told quietly in workers' quarters and cargo holds across a dozen conquered worlds. A small, dangerous seed of doubt planted in an empire that had never once needed to doubt itself before. Back at Ashfall Station, 3 weeks after the battle, Captain Elena Cross stood once again on the observation deck above the hangar, looking down at the nightshade as engineering crews finished the last repairs from her long and difficult mission. Dr. Nair joined her, carrying 2 cups of coffee, handing one over without a word. She held together better than I expected, Nair said, nodding toward the ship below. I'll need to redesign parts of the power system before we can push her that hard again. But she held. She did, Cross agreed. So did the crew. Do you think the Korath will come back? Nair asked. With a bigger fleet, better prepared this time? Cross considered the question for a long moment, watching engineers move quietly around the black hull of the ship that had ended a war before most of Earth even knew it had truly begun. Maybe, she said. Empires like that don't usually forgive an embarrassment this size. But if they do come back, they'll be looking over their shoulder the whole way, wondering if we're already there, watching, waiting. And will we be? Cross allowed herself a small, thin smile, the same kind of smile Ambassador Webb had once allowed himself, in a cold meeting room, 10 days before an invisible ship taught an entire empire not to underestimate the people they had once found so easy to mock. Every time, she said quietly. That's the whole point. They'll never see us coming. They'll never even know we're there. And that, in the end, is exactly what beats them. Nair considered this, turning her cup slowly in her hands. You know, my father used to say the best defense was always seeing the other side first. I used to think I'd built something that broke that rule completely. Now I'm not so sure. Maybe hiding well enough is just another way of seeing first. They never saw us. We saw everything. Cross nodded slowly. That's not a bad way to put it. I'll put it in my next funding request, Nair said, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, she managed something close to a real laugh. Below, in the quiet dark of the hangar, the nightshade sat waiting, patient and unseen, ready for whatever came next.